Well, thanks to everybody for your fantastic presentations. I look forward to reading the rest of the papers in the journal too. I promise I will read the papers of the people who are not here. Okay, great. I mean, what I think is really interesting is that although Nicola and Sophie started off by pointing out that there are large areas of disagreement, right, between the contributors to volume, right, lots of areas that where they have different perspectives. In fact, what I found interesting about these presentations today is some recurring common themes coming up. So this issue of some kind of radical departure is something which has recurred in lots of the presentations, really in all of them, I would say, in one way or another. So I think at a general level, certainly both Sala and Vanessa are talking about the need for some kind of radical departure from the sort of standardised neoliberal approach to peace building which we seem to currently have at the moment, and have been pointing out a lot of the negative impacts that particular agenda has for the experiences of women and also for gender relations in post-conflict societies or in attempts to achieve peace agreements. I was really interested in what Sala was saying about how much more complicated the issues of wartime sexual violence are on the ground for actual victims and probably by extension for perpetrators as well and for their wider communities. How much more complicated these issues are than our approach seems to have, and these issues of transitional justice. Right, we, as an international code of community, so much effort over the past few years has gone into establishing things like the International Criminal Court as a result of the tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, and that engenders a very particular idea of justice and transitional mechanisms, which, as Sala points out, is very much focused on prosecution, sending people to jail, accountability, and I think what she has shown is that there are some significant problems for that. In terms of, particularly, it seemed to me, what she was saying was in terms of the wider economic context for women, and that issue of the problem of the wider economic context for women in a post-war situation is something that Margaret was also obviously very concerned with a particular interest on widows. And I was sort of wondering, for Sala, sort of what this kind of radical departure in terms of our ideas about transitional justice might look like, and what that means in terms of the vested interests that Vanessa was talking about, the vested interests that international institutions, donor agencies, the UN, various governments have in a particular conception of peace building, which is based around a particular conception of a post-conflict society. And again, this idea of competing understandings about what the post-conflict society should look like is something that has come up in a lot of the papers and something that Laura is specifically looking at in regard to Serbia. So it seems to me that there's a lot of really interesting, really challenging kind of scope for new approaches and new conceptualizations here, and what all of the presenters are saying. But I guess, being somewhat of a pessimist like V, I'm not sure how we do that and what that will look like, and I guess I'm interested in what the resistance to that will be, right, from all those bodies that have these kind of vested interests that V was talking about. And I thought that was fascinating with Laura's case study of Serbia, as well, that sort of that disjuncture between certain feminist groups like Women in Black, who are also similarly seem to be calling for this kind of radical rethink, this sort of radical departure from traditional sort of militarist and neoliberal understandings of what a post-conflict society would look like, and therefore what that means for ideas of justice and the positioning of women and men in society. I'm not surprised that Women in Black would take that kind of angle, but it must be incredibly frustrating for them, because I suspect, given that there seems to be this competition over what will be constituted as the national action plan for Serbia, my cynicism is that women in black will be less listened to in that than the sort of the Ministry of Defence's interpretation. And yeah, just from a kind of personal interest in terms of female combatants, I think it's fascinating that the Serbian military seems to be calling for, what was it, 35%, having the goal of 35% female soldiers in the military. And that the disjunction between that current call and the actions of the Serbian state in the past in terms of funding and supporting organisations that were involved in wide-scale sexual violence against women, I think is huge, and the fact that they're not addressing that disjuncture, I think, is a huge problem as well. And just the last thing is this issue of, sorry, two more. Have I got two more? One last point is, I think another commonality that's come up is this huge issue of the fact that women are not homogenous, right? That women are divided by various different kinds of social positionings, identities, economic positioning, and have different needs. And the example of women as widows or wives of missing people is one example of how women are not all the same and have different needs. And you know, I think from a sort of an ideological perspective, perhaps I think that, or a conceptual perspective, there is really a problem with Resolution 1325 in not really managing to grapple with that issue of women's heterogeneity. And I think that is, you know, something which comes up in a lot of the feminist critiques of 1325. But you know, I don't think we've really got any further in how we actually deal with that as a reality. Right? How do we deal with that heterogeneity if we're still trying to use 1325 on the ground to actually do some good? And finally, my last point was that about this issue of rape as a weapon of war, which both Sala and Margaret have addressed directly, but I think also some of what Vi was saying is very significant here too, in terms of what's happening in Palestine. I found it really heartening actually to be amongst a group of feminists who also are sort of having a problem with this expression, rape as a weapon of war, because I also sort of share concerns with this, and I think it's really, really significant that so many of these papers are pointing out problems like the fact that we so commonly talk of rape as a weapon of war leaves out so many other categories of victims. It leaves out victims who are not specifically targeted as part of a military program, which is what we tend to assume is the meaning of rape as a weapon of war. It also leaves out other forms of sexual violence, which can be hugely significant in a lot of conflicts, non-rape forms of sexual violence. And I think although today we're at a point in our approaches to wartime sexual violence that we have moved on from the language of rape, and we see the phrase sexual violence as more appropriate because it encompasses all these other actions which we have also come to acknowledge are heinous and are acts of sexual violence. At the same time, I think often in the literature sexual violence is used as a phrase, but really it's shorthand for rape, right? And actually what people are going on to discuss is usually then narrowed down to rape, and then often further narrowed down to rape as a weapon of war, or rape as a deliberate military strategy, or rape as genocide, right? And it leaves out all these other things which all of you are pointing out to do with the more private forms of sexual violence, which feminists discussing rape in peacetime have been grappling with for decades, right? And the issue of rape in the context of rape and other forms of sexual torture and other forms of physical abuse that is not necessarily sexual but is possibly gendered, in terms of the domestic violence that occurs in wartime settings, and the fact that we know that levels of domestic violence increase significantly in times of war and in the post-war context, which I think was a really significant point. And I think that's, I'm really, really pleased to see that issue being drawn out, and I hope that it is kind of pushed further. And I will leave it there.